Calling to meeting the order of the Wheat Ridge Planning Commission for January 18th, 2024. The clerk please take roll.
Jonathan Shelkey.
Here.
Jerry DiTullio.
Here.
Daniel Gravy.
Here.
Patrick Quinn.
Here.
Will Kearns.
Here.
And Christine Disney and Janet Leo are absent tonight.
Thank you. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Do we have any changes to the order of the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda will stand as published. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of December 7th, 2023?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Second. We have a motion to approve the minutes. It was seconded by Commissioner Greavy. Please poll the commission.
Motion approved 3-0 with 2 abstaining.
The next item on the agenda is public comment. This is the time for any person to speak on any subject not appearing on the agenda. Public comments are limited to 3 minutes. Do we have anybody on Zoom tonight? Because I see nobody in the office or in the council chambers. Are you here for public comment? Yes, about the agenda item. Okay. Do we have anybody for something not on the agenda?
Nobody on Zoom.
Okay. We'll move on to public hearings. I'm going to open the public hearing, and Commissioner Kearns, please introduce agenda item A.
This is an ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning electric vehicle EV charging and parking requirements, and making conforming amendments therewith. The proposed ordinance creates regulations for electric vehicle EV parking and charging facilities within the zoning code, defines terms related to EVs, allows for EV charging facilities of various types throughout the city, and establishes minimum EV parking space requirements. Notice for this public hearing was provided by the Code of Laws.
Thank you. We'll move on to the staff presentation. And before you start, I'll swear everybody in. You swear to tell the truth in this matter?
I do.
Thank you.
All right, no formal presentation tonight. Good evening, Planning Commission. I'm Scott Cutler, Senior Planner at the City of Wheat Ridge. Just wanted to present on this ordinance tonight regarding EV charging and parking requirements. So I'm going to give a little bit of background, and this was included in the staff report as well. We don't currently have any requirements related to EV parking and charging in the city code anywhere. We do have adopted building codes that allow EV charging, but doesn't actually mandate placement or design or anything like that. We actually brought EV parking and charging to council a couple times, and in, I believe it was April of 2023, City Council gave us the direction to work on an ordinance or at least some parameters. And then we went back to council in August of 2023 and kind of had to revise our recommendations due to a state legislation that was passed, House Bill 23-1233, which was to require some certain things of municipalities statewide related to EV charging. But we were already planning on adopting EV parking ordinance. Our recommendations were slightly different than the state's, but not too far off. So I'll get into that in just a second, but I want to give a little bit more background on the House bill that passed in June 2023. And the main thing is that state multi-unit buildings are now required to provide EV parking as of March 1st, 2024, statewide. The purpose of the state legislation is to further the state goals related to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and to expand charging infrastructure necessary to support growing EV market share, and really not stand in the way of people charging their vehicles. So there are three main components that apply to Wheat Ridge in that state law. One is compliance with all of the EV requirements in the Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready Code by March 1st. That includes minimum parking requirements, then prohibiting unreasonable restrictions on EV installations for both tenants and owners. We can't prohibit someone from installing EV infrastructure if they want to. And then prohibits local governments from banning EV parking or charging. So those are the things that apply to Wheat Ridge. Everything else is voluntary, and I'll get into those differences in a minute. Right now, we're not seeing the private market deliver on EV spaces in new development, despite actual market saturation. We have also seen limited interest in building freestanding EV charging facilities. Some of that's due to the zoning code not allowing it currently. It's silent to it, and if something's not in the zoning code and it's silent, that means it's not technically allowed. So by allowing EV charging facilities throughout the city, some of that market can start to develop. So this ordinance is based on City Council consensus on August 7th, 2023. Like I said, we had previously recommended that council adopt EV regulations, and then the state law changed our recommendations a little bit. So council's consensus was to draft an ordinance to comply with the minimum requirements of HB 23-1233, and then also to create some additional regulations and definitions for EV parking. So the ordinance that was drafted and attached for you all to review accomplishes a few things: creates definitions in the zoning code related to EVs, including electric vehicle charging stations, retail electric vehicle charging stations, and EV parking spaces. It creates standards within the city's parking requirements related to charging, including establishing minimum parking requirements to comply with state law. It allows electric vehicle charging stations as an accessory use in all zone districts, so it would allow EV charging in a home garage, in a parking lot, or at a gas station. And then it allows retail EVCS, the electric vehicle charging stations, in all commercial mixed-use and industrial zone districts. So to get into it a little bit, a retail EVCS is a grouping of multiple charging stations as the primary use of a property. There are some already in the area. Tesla superchargers could be considered retail EVCS. It can also be a standalone facility that might have a convenience store. Really, essentially functions the same as a gas station. We also are going to allow, not related to state law, EV parking to be shared if other conditions of shared parking agreements can be met. And then it updates, makes some other minor updates to comply with the House bill related to accessibility. So this was all covered in the staff report, but I'll go over quickly the three types of charging facilities. There's three tiers, and they're really based on cost. And then the minimum parking requirements are kind of tiered as well. So EV-capable facilities are related to facilities where infrastructure is available for future installation, but really it's just creating conduit, it's adding space to a breaker, but no actual wiring or charging equipment is installed. It just allows for future installation when ready. And the state of Colorado actually created an even lighter version of EV-capable called EV-capable Light. And that only includes the conduit, no other space. But this is really setting up for the future where someone would be building a parking lot, and then in 20 years they may have to come back in, and all they would have to do is add the wire. They don't have to rip up the parking lot anymore. Requiring EV-capable and doing EV-capable spaces saves hundreds of thousands of dollars if it's done up front versus going back in and ripping up the parking lot in the future. EV-ready spaces are facilities where the necessary infrastructure and wiring is installed, but there's not an actual charger station at the end of it. This usually means something that terminates, and then in the future, someone can come in, pull a permit, get a charger installed really quickly. But EV-ready also means a 240-volt wired outlet in a garage for someone that lives in a single-unit home, duplex, or townhouse where they could charge their vehicle in their own garage. The market is actually already delivering this, and most new homes that I've seen have that in the garage. They also, large appliances already run on it. It's pretty common to see this. And then the EV-installed charging facility is the complete charging facility that includes all the infrastructure, outlet, and the charging station. There's one outside at City Hall. That's an EV-installed. That's a level 2 charger, so it's a little bit slower, but there's also level 3 chargers, which are really advanced quick charging stations, and those are the most expensive to install. So the main component of the House bill is to require minimum parking requirements, specifically to multi-unit residential, but the city will also be required to adopt the statewide building code requirements, which will then apply to commercial. So we're including all of this in the zoning code to allow planning staff, my team, to easily locate the requirements and request the parking spaces be included during site plan review, so this isn't being caught at the very end and being a surprise to someone that's pulling a building permit. All the minimum requirements are found in the ordinance, and we can go over those if you have questions. I'm not going to go through each percentage requirement. But basically, the highest requirement is for the multi-unit residential. That's where the highest demand is. Most charging happens overnight, and that's what the state House bill is requiring. Lower for commercial, a lot lower for developments that have very limited parking, and then an even lower requirement for industrial, and including exemptions for warehouse and distribution space. So very low requirements for industrial. And there's also some requirements that council requested regarding redevelopment. We don't want this to be an ordinance that's applied in full to a property that's choosing voluntarily to redevelop. This would only apply to brand new development in the city. And then there are some instances where council has requested some capable spaces to be installed as part of major remodels or major changes of use, but no charging station would be required if someone was just trying to come in and remodel an existing space or add an addition or something like that. So it's meant to be business friendly to existing businesses that are attempting to just remodel their properties. I think I've covered it all, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thanks. We'll move on to public comment and come back for commissioner questions. So for public comment, please come on up and state your name and spell your last name for the record and where your address or city.
Hi, I'm Betsy Kopic, C-O-P-P-O-C-K. I'm at 25 Skyline Drive.
Thank you.
So I wanted to chat with you about this for a few minutes. I'm an EV owner. I'm on Sustainable Wheat Ridge. We're meeting next door. There were several written comments from my fellow members. I thought I'd just kind of give you a little different tact on some of the things that we strongly believe in. And I thought I'd just tell you about why it's so important to have this at the residential multifamily level. And if you think about our makeup of our population and the young people and how they can't purchase single-family residential homes, but they're adamant to try to improve the sustainability of their community, that it would be really helpful for them to be able to purchase an electric vehicle so they could charge it and be able to charge an electric vehicle in their residence instead of having to go to where it's very expensive to do a level 3 charger. To use a level 3 charger, which is what you think about when you're on the road, it costs 3 to 4 times as much. So this is why it's so important for us to have those. And I always think, of course, of my kids and our youth, and they're never going to be able to buy a house, or maybe, for years they won't, but they're going to be buying a car. And we need them to be able to charge. So that's one other thing is, it's the same thing with the bicycles. I know it's agenda item number 2, but I got to go back. And it's so important for the younger people to be able to store their bicycles, etc. And they'll be the ones using the bikes as we all get too old for that. So that's all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So move on to commission questions. Or did you have any more? Oh. Sorry, on my left, any questions here for the staff? Mr. Shelkey?
Well, I had a garage built a couple years ago, and when my builder built the garage, they put the 240 in the garage. Was that a code thing for new garages? Or he just did it?
I can't speak to the exact building code requirements, but it's really common, and it also is something that people are looking for when they're purchasing. So that might have, I'm not sure if it's a requirement or not of the current code. I'm sure it will be for the next building code cycle, though.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Quinn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Cutler, for your presentation. A couple of questions, because I tried reading the new code here. And so you're saying that the House bill that this is addressing is mainly for single-family residential, kind of covers that, do what Commissioner just talked about, having 240 Rand to have it EV ready. Is that correct?
Right, it covers multi-unit residential and single-family. So for single-family, it would require one, if you're providing garage parking, that there's one 240-volt outlet. For multi-unit residential, it's requiring a certain percentage of actual charging stations, like in the parking lot of an apartment complex, or those EV-capable spaces that are set up to be wired in the future. So it just depends on the size of the development, but the chart, I think it's table 12 in the ordinance has all those percentages there.
Okay, so that's, I got you. So regular house, we get 240 in it. Apartment complex, we have several parking places that will either have conduit or be ready for a charger or whatnot.
Correct, yes.
Sweet. Just an observation maybe, because we were talking about parking places a few months ago in deed specific, like affordable housing projects. How does this affect that? Because we were trying to not have parking places, and now we're going to restrict that even more. So what does that look like?
Right, so the same requirements to provide, so the requirements for multi-unit housing, affordable housing is lower in terms of the number of parking spaces they have to provide. The same percentages apply. These are just matching what we're required to do from the state, but I think the overall quantity of charging stations will be lower because the overall number of spaces are going to be lower as well.
10-4. And one last question. Just like handicap spaces, what happens if somebody parks in this that doesn't have an EV?
So that's actually a pretty good question. The House bill actually sets cities up for success and allows them to enforce if signage is provided. So our ordinance, really all we can say is an owner can restrict and you can provide signage that signifies it as EV parking. There's going to be spaces that are both accessible and EV, but there's also going to be designated EV spaces, and then it's up to the local jurisdiction to, or a landlord or property owner to enforce that. Unless it's public, it won't be the city enforcing it.
Thank you, Mr. Cutler. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Grady?
Just to follow up on that, when you had mentioned the shared allowance for a shared space, I thought that that's what you were indicating, in that if there's space is built out, but let's say there aren't enough EV owners that are residents of this, that they can use those for regular parking, and then, I mean, that's what I took away from the shared, but maybe that meant something else in that context.
Yeah, so the shared parking is really saying, we already allow shared parking, so if a business can't provide enough parking on its own, they can ask their neighbor and file an agreement and basically share it if their hours are different. And that's the same intent here. So let's say a business is required to provide 8 EV parking, that's pretty high, but they can only provide 4, but their neighbor has 12, and their neighbor has different hours. They can do a shared parking agreement to, I guess, fulfill their full amount. This also was meant to basically say, we understand that shopping centers are regional, and so we're not going to go in and say, this business has to have this parking space here. They can kind of bank the parking spaces in a regional way. Could also happen on 38th, where we know there's like city parking lots and things like that.
Commissioner Kearns?
So I'm looking at the parking requirements, and having one EV ready charging station per unit of single unit residential seems like a lot. can you talk a little bit about, and the building code is single unit duplex and single unit attached single unit attached. And then it says in parentheses, townhome. So what's a single unit townhome? Is that what it means?
Yeah, so the way our code is written is single unit attached is a townhome. They're one and the same.
Okay.
And that EV Ready that you're looking at, that's just the 240 in the garage. So there's not a charging facility for EV Ready. It's just an outlet.
240 in the garage?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. That's my only question.
So what you're saying is that the county attorney interpreted the state law to require this change to our ordinances for EV charging?
Yes, and that was also council's request as well.
But it's really coming from the state down, that this has to be codified.
Yes.
So going back to the question about affordable housing, so that project at 44th and Wadsworth, if this was in place and the AMI is 60%, we're really assuming that the people living there are going to have an electric vehicle and they're at 60% of the AMI, and so we're going to require the developer, would the housing authority have to add these to that project if this was enforced for that 44th and Wadsworth project?
I think based on the current requirements, yes. We understand, though, that state legislation is constantly changing, and we recognize we will probably have to be back with amendments to this as we figure things out. This is the first step to get compliant, though, because I actually understand where you're coming from on that. I think this is just how we're complying with state law, and we can have that discussion with those developers at the time they need to provide that parking.
Well, they have a second phase of that project. I'm just using them as an example. So at 44th and Wadsworth, they have a second phase of building. If this passes through council, will they have to comply then, and that one new section of the project's going to have the EV charging just for that one section, for that one new build?
It would, yeah, any future phases after March 1st. It's, the actual charging station is 5%. So if you're looking at a 20-unit building, that's one parking space that's a charger, so it's not actually that high of a percentage. The majority of that percentage is the conduit under the parking lot for future installation.
Okay. Thank you. I forgot to mention, do we have anybody on the public that wants to speak about this on Zoom? Do we have any more questions from commissioners before I close the public hearing? Commissioner Quinn?
So we were talking about townhouses. What if they don't have garages? What if it's just outside parking?
My understanding is that it would still be one per unit, but there would be the ability to have a shared garage or something like that. The way we interpreted the code is it's fairly flexible. I don't think it would mandate you to have a garage with a space. You could still find a more regional solution for the complex, for example. To be honest with you, I don't think the building code is that clear in terms of what form it needs to take, so we would just be looking that they're providing it somewhere on the site. It doesn't have to be in the house, for example.
Does that hinder somebody trying to build these? We're trying to make them affordable, so maybe we, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, and with all due respect to our friends with Sustainable Wheat Ridge, but if we're trying to build some affordable housing here, maybe we don't put garages on there so we can A, get more units, and B, bring the prices down, but we're gonna make everybody we're gonna make these folks throw conduit somewhere at a minimum for something, and that's all gonna be reflective in the cost
Right.
for everything. And we're also assuming that these, people that can't afford a house are also gonna go buy a used Tesla at 60,000 versus, I'm
Yeah.
trying not to be, I'm just trying to get a grasp on it. I mean, we have to do what we have to do for the
No,
state.
understood.
But I'm just wondering if this needs to be a little bit more refined, or are we gonna hinder? That's what I'm kind of worried about.
I can speak to that, and to answer your original question, the footnote on the one per unit actually says, for any dwelling unit with a dedicated attached or detached garage or other on-site designated parking provided for the dwelling unit. So there are options in that way. From the cost perspective, Wheat Ridge is already one of the last communities in Colorado to have EV ordinances related to minimum parking, and development is still occurring across Colorado pretty much unhindered. I think it probably will add a bit of cost, but we haven't been approached by any developer saying that they wouldn't be able to comply with these requirements. That doesn't mean it's not going to necessarily add cost up front.
Understood. Once again, thanks for the presentation and taking questions, and I would have tried to get them a little sooner, but didn't quite happen. These kind of came spur of the moment. So thank you, Scott. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
I do have one more comment, and it's related to what we've been talking about, the same subject. When you're providing one 240-volt charging outlet per unit for any dwelling with designated parking provided for the dwelling unit, which means out in a parking lot, I'm thinking of like, say, a condominium complex where the condos are single units and maybe don't have garages, but they share a dedicated parking lot. In this case, every parking space would have to have a 240-volt outlet. But actually, you could cut this in half by having one 240-volt outlet per 2 spaces, so that if you build the charging station out, the charging station then has 2 cables and each outlet can service 2 vehicles. Does that make sense? It cuts down the developer's cost. It still allows 2 vehicles to plug into a single point, so you're cutting down on the amount of infrastructure that the developer would have to build by half.
That's pretty common. That's actually how the City Hall one functions. That's a level 2 charger. That's not one of the light ones. But there's only one, I guess, I don't know, unit, and then there's 2 plugs.
One unit with 2 plugs.
And to your point about condos, that's actually considered multi-unit residential anyway. That's
Okay.
more of like an apartment tower or something.
So when would you have a single unit with designated parking provided for the dwelling unit? What does that look like?
That would just be someone builds a house and they choose not to build a garage.
But they still have to provide a 240-volt outlet somewhere on the property?
I believe so, yes.
And it has I'm assuming it has a junction box, or it's inside of some kind of enclosure because it's EV ready, which means that it has to be built into a charging station.
No, charging stations are different. So that's the commercial-looking infrastructure that you're seeing outside.
Yep.
This is simply an outlet.
It's just a plug.
Yep.
Okay. Can a 240-volt outlet have conduit capable to support 2 outlets? Or is it just like one plug per outlet? I feel like
That's
there's a
probably
way to do
outside of
this
our
smarter.
wheelhouse. That's a building code question.
Yeah,
But I mean,
okay.
as long as something meets electrical code, you can basically do anything, as long
Yeah.
as it meets.
Yeah.
Think of it like a dryer.
Yeah,
So
a
if you
dryer.
had 2 dryers, you'd need 2 plugs.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, if somebody didn't have a garage, they would still be required to provide some on-site parking. So it may not have a garage per se, but they would have probably some driveway area that would be required to have that plug available to plug in.
Okay.
So, but if they wanted to, they could opt if both, a couple had 2 EV vehicles and they wanted to get a second 240 plug in their garage or outside of their garage, they could do that. I think one of the state things is that we can't prohibit them from doing that.
Okay.
And so that's just, it's very much like a dryer plug.
Yeah. So I guess for parking lots that have to have this requirement, I would just make a recommendation that we try to be smart about how we install these things and try to allow for one dual plug conduit per 2 spaces, right? So that way you have 2 spaces with with the conduit outlet, and it has 2 plugs for 2, that way it's not 1 plug every space, right?
Right, and
You do
that's pretty common practice already. So as long as the actual plug is there, I don't think we care what it looks like. You don't need 1 pole per space or
Yeah.
whatever. That's how it is out here. This is counting as 2 EV spaces, even though there's only 1 station, I guess. There's still 2 plugs.
Okay. Thank you, that's it.
I had one more, just kind of clarifying. So this conversation around, not covered parking, like in a parking lot and meeting these requirements, it's essentially trying to eventually get towards EV charging stations. Because when if you look at the multi-unit residential, the 5% for the EV charging station, well, that knocks off 5% of the others down the line because it meets all of them. And then, it kind of is a domino effect that way, but you requiring 30% of the capable light as the first step to eventually having charging stations in the parking lot, like you have out here, for example, as essentially, a replacement for gas stations. I mean, if you look way down the road, it's going to be just a lot of at-home on-site charging. I mean, just to give us a visual of the non-covered, not a garage, end game for these surface lots.
Right, yeah, that's correct. And the data shows that the vast majority of charging happens at home, so that's why the multi-unit residential is the highest, and then the commercial and industrial is much lower, because we don't anticipate ever needing or really even wanting that amount of charging on a commercial basis. But if you have an assigned parking space at your apartment in 30 years, whatever, it'll be eventually capable of adding a station when the time comes. It's just future thinking. It's so, people don't have to rip up parking lots in 20 years when EV adoption rates are higher.
Yeah, and I would add to that, in my experience in other communities, it was actually really smart to add in this capable light because it's just the conduit and not the space in the breaker box or adding another breaker box and doing all the wiring. And so this provides some leeway that I think I've heard complaints from when I was in other communities where they had required a higher number or a higher percentage of the EV capable. And yeah, it's the conduit, but it was also the wiring and the space within the box. So basically they could just be ready to get a station in whichever parking space. And so I think that adding this capable light is actually a really smart move toward keeping the infrastructure cost way down, but it also prevents having to rip up that parking lot, which is a cost to the future owner of the property, and not having to go through, materials, because as we know, materials are a huge waste item. So I think this was a good addition from the state to add that light figure in there.
I guess the only concern I have is that we have lowered the parking requirements for multifamily to where we have like a quarter space per unit, and then we're going to take up more space with an EV charger. We're basically putting cars that are parked on the street versus parked in the lot. And then if we have folks that are unable to even have an EV, that spot's going to be basically empty, because if they're AMI 60%, they're not going to be able to afford it. So all I'm asking is that either the planning department or the council or both look at this conflict of less parking, but now we're requiring more stuff in the parking that's going to take away spots. I mean, I know that people like to see cars go away, but I don't think cars have gone away. In fact, they've become more prevalent. I mean, we had a council person a long time ago say that cars were a thing of the past. And if you drive around town, cars are not a thing of the past. So I just think that the city should look at the parking requirements versus the EV requirements versus all these little things we're adding, so that people are not forced to park on the street or park far away from their property, especially if they're a senior or if they're a person with a child, and they have to walk to get to their property. Or, like I mentioned in the past, if they have a lot of tools and they're working on site and they have to be traveling, they can't take RTD or public transportation, so, anyway, that's my recommendation. Any other questions or comments before I close the public hearing? And I'm going to close the public hearing and a motion's in order. Commissioner Kearns?
I move to approve, can I make a motion?
Yeah,
I
you
need
may.
to ask to make a motion?
Yes, the recommendation.
Okay. I move to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning electric vehicle EV charging and parking requirements and making conforming amendments therewith. Exhibits are 1, proposed ordinance, 2, EV information guide from Sustainable Wheat Ridge, edited by Sustainability Coordinator Mary Hester.
Is there a second on the motion to approve?
Second, Mr. Chairman.
We have a motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Quinn. Any comments on the motion? Please poll the commission.
Somebody not, oh, no, we're good. Motion approved, 5-0.
Thank you. Item B, Commissioner Shelkey, please read the title and the summary or issue.
An ordinance amending Articles 5 and 11 of Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning bicycle parking and storage requirements and making conforming amendments therewith. The proposed ordinance creates a long-term bicycle storage requirements for large multi-unit residential developments, updates and clarifies vehicle parking reduction allowances when additional bicycle parking is required, and decouples bicycle parking requirements from vehicle parking requirements. Notice for this public hearing was provided by the Code of Laws.
I'm going to open the public hearing and we'll move on to a staff report. Mr. Cutler, do you swear to tell the truth in this matter?
I do.
Thank you.
Thanks. Once again, hello. This ordinance was also on the same track with City Council as the EV ordinance. It's of a little bit similar vein in that it was brought up in the same study session, but it actually is going to do pretty significantly different things. We got direction in April of 2023 to begin research on bicycle parking requirements, including the potential for e-bike charging based on best practices and zoning codes. And then in August, we got direction from council to proceed with the ordinance as proposed, generally taking the form of the ordinance as attached. So we have current bicycle parking requirements in section 26.501 of the municipal code, and then we also have other bicycle parking requirements specific to mixed use requirements in that chapter, Article 11. In June of last year, council approved an ordinance which increased slightly bicycle parking requirements in the mixed use zone districts for multi-unit residential developments and for commercial developments. They were actually essentially doubled from the previous version of the mixed use code, and it also encouraged indoor bicycle parking for multi-unit residential development, but we knew we had to do more research, so we didn't actually require it at that time. There's also no contemplation for indoor bicycle storage, which is an increasing item of demand that we've been hearing about. And the code also provides some incentives to reduce overall vehicle parking if additional bicycle parking beyond the minimum is required, up to 10% max. Right now, also, the requirements for bicycle parking spaces are tied to the number of vehicle parking spaces, and as we discussed with the last ordinance, we're seeing smaller amounts of vehicle parking being required, so that means kind of by default that bicycle parking also has much fewer requirements. Thinking about bike storage in Colorado, there's a really noticeable difference between a typical outdoor bicycle parking space and a secured indoor facility. U-racks, like you see outside of a lot of commercial businesses and some apartment buildings, are reasonable for temporary bicycle parking, especially when they're placed near the entrance or areas of congregation, but they're not a secure solution for long-term bicycle storage due to theft risk and also weather. Long-term bicycle parking can come in a lot of different forms, and there was a photo in the staff report of one that was in a new apartment building in Wheat Ridge at the Parallel. Often there are long-term bicycle storage rooms within an apartment building. I actually live in an apartment building where it's under the stairwell, so it was essentially unused space that they converted to bicycle storage. There's also sometimes gated lockers within a parking garage. A couple of unused spaces are converted that way, or some sort of bicycle corral outside of an apartment building. Some apartment developers have actually already voluntarily provided these, but others, especially I would say out-of-state developers who aren't as familiar with our codes, have not elected to do so unless required. And so the image below, you can see that's from the Parallel Apartments, and they voluntarily chose to do that. So this ordinance does a few things. The main thing that was different than the council consensus was the addition to decouple bicycle parking from vehicle parking. This really is just requiring bicycle parking at a rate based on the square footage of the building. We already do that for vehicle parking, so it's actually easier for us to administer, and it is not affected by any vehicle parking reductions. It also clarifies those vehicle parking reductions. We still are not going to allow more than a 10% reduction. We know people still have cars, but it clarifies when those reductions can be provided. It also will provide some additional incentives for office uses or institutional uses to provide, again, voluntarily, some long-term bicycle storage or changing facilities within the office building. That's really common. That's exists in downtown Denver already. We don't expect people to necessarily do this, but having it in our code provides people the flexibility. It will not ever be a requirement. The code amendment will add standards for long-term bicycle parking, including security and weather protection. And the main thing that it does is update minimum bicycle parking requirements for all uses to better align with mixed-use code updates. Lastly, it will add minimum long-term bicycle storage requirements for multi-unit apartment and condo developments over 50 dwelling units. This is only the largest apartment buildings that we see. We don't get a lot of these. We recognize that this requirement would likely be more burdensome for a small apartment developer or small apartment building, and may not make as much sense. But on these large 5-story, 6-story apartment buildings, we've been seeing having a dedicated space to secure tenants' bicycle parking is really a big deal, and something that most other cities in our area already require. For a number of reasons, again, theft is a main issue. Apartment sizes are very small, and there's actually not a lot of space within those units to store bicycles. And then storing it on the street is just not something that a lot of people want to do. So this is kind of codifying something that's already happening, but not all developers are choosing to do this at this time. This will make it a requirement, but again, for only those apartment buildings over 50 dwelling units. With that, I am happy to take questions after public comment. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we don't have anybody in here for public comment. Do we have anybody on Zoom for public comment for this item?
Nobody on Zoom.
Thanks. So I'll move on to my right. Any questions, Commissioner Kearns or Commissioner Gravy?
I'm just curious about the incentives for like providing both this long-term storage and shower and changing facilities. So the incentives are that if they provide shower and changing facilities, they get they can provide less parking spaces per. Is that the incentive, or it's fewer parking spaces?
Fewer parking spaces, yes. So that would be kind of, if they're providing like locker rooms. This is really only common in a large institutional or office user, which we don't see a lot of in Wheat Ridge. Pretty common in downtown areas, but as we, if the Lutheran campus redevelops, for example, and we see office users, that would be an incentive for them to provide those facilities to their employees, and then they could slightly reduce their overall parking requirement.
So how much do they get, how much of a reduction do they get? I see that there's a following additional reductions may be combined with the 10% bicycle parking reduction. Oh, so does that mean if you provide long-term bicycle parking, you get to reduce your automobile parking by 10%?
5% for long-term, and then an additional 5% if those locker room facilities are provided.
Okay.
But the original 10% reduction, which is still in the code, is if you're providing more bicycle parking than is required by code, then you can reduce your vehicle parking. We've not ever seen anyone do that from a office user. We've seen that on a restaurant where like someone can't actually physically put amount of vehicle parking spaces, so they use that essentially as a variance to reduce their required vehicle parking spaces by adding more bike parking than is required.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Gravy?
Yeah, I wonder if you could summarize for me the component of bicycle charging infrastructure that is related to this ordinance change, because I know that there's been a tremendous growth in electric bikes, and clearly those kind of bikes have different parking and storage needs than standard bicycles, and I know that there's some in this. I'd have to refresh my memory, but maybe you can do that because you're more familiar with it.
Yeah, so a couple things on that. I think one is the demand for indoor bicycle storage has gotten higher with the rise of e-bikes. I think they're more expensive and people are not wanting to just leave them outside, but also people will have to charge them at some point. Not all of them have removable batteries, so having them inside helps with that, or you can remove your battery and charge it in your own house. This ordinance doesn't actually provide anything in terms of e-bike parking different from regular bike parking, except for that, for those large apartment buildings, those bike rooms can have plugs that can charge those bicycles inside. That's actually would never be in the zoning code, that's in the building code. And those rooms are not actually required now to have outlets in them, but I think the Parallels, they provided those outlets voluntarily because they knew people were going to want to bring tools down to the bike room too and things like that. But there's nothing specific in this ordinance related to e-bike charging other than having bicycles inside is more preferable to those, that market.
And the inside bicycle storage is really about the long-term bicycle storage as it relates to this ordinance.
Right, or a daily commuter that wants to park their bike inside overnight instead of locking it up outside and hoping it's dry or hoping it's still there.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think a lot of apartment operators are finding that people are bringing their bicycles up into the apartment, and so this would also be somewhere safe that they could store it without having it inside their apartment. And they're also, it is a battery and it could, I suppose, catch fire. And there were some bicycle batteries that they were, as I've understood it from the apartment operators, there's a concern that if everybody's bringing their bicycle with the battery up and charging it, that it could increase the risk of a fire happening. So this would provide a safe indoor secure area where they wouldn't have to worry about their bicycle being left on the street, and they also wouldn't be bringing it into the apartment or putting it on their patio, for example.
Any other questions? Commissioner Quinn or Commissioner Shelkey, any questions?
Thanks, Scott, for the report. This is all on like the ground floor, because I can recall Council Member Hulteen talking about during this study session or whatever, with like getting it in the elevator or getting it to another floor. Does this require it to be like on a ground floor? I know it's kind of a weird question, but that's what I just thought of.
That's a good question, and that's to Jana's point. A lot of people don't want to drag these heavier bikes up a flight of stairs, or some of them won't even fit in an elevator. The ordinance doesn't go that far to require it on the ground floor, but it does, sorry, I'm trying to find, it does have some requirements. So the storage facilities have to be secured, weather protected, within the primary building, enclosed, or an enclosure within a parking garage, or within 100 feet of the primary entrance. So I think when you're in these larger buildings, it starts to get further away if you're going to the second floor. I've never seen that.
Yeah, it kind of would make sense for it to be something on the ground, but you never know, just, there'd be that one chance in 1,000, somebody puts the bicycle parking on the roof with the pool.
Well, just a comment, so I have an e-bike, and when I go to work part-time, I commute on the e-bike, and I commute to downtown, to 16th and Broadway, and I can get there faster on the e-bike than I can driving or any other way. So it's a great way to go. In the building that I work in, the bicycle storage is right in the basement where the parking is for cars. And the nice thing is your access key lets you right in. You put your bike in the storage room. There's no outlets because I think anybody who's riding an e-bike knows how far they can go. So, that's not an issue. But the nice thing is that you're right there. You have an elevator, it takes you right up to the floor you need to go to. So, yeah, I think it's only going to grow in popularity. And so if you have an office building type situation, having bicycle storage secured like that is a great thing.
Thank you. Any other questions before I close the public hearing? I'll close the public hearing and motion's in order.
I move to recommend approval of the proposed ordinances amending Article 5 and 11 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning bicycle parking and storage requirements and making conforming amendments therewith.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion for approval, and a second by Commissioner Kearns. Comments on the motion? Please poll the commission.
Motion approved, 5-0.
Well, thank you. That concludes our public hearings. We'll move on to item 8, which is old business. Do we have any old business? How about any new business?
Hi, thank you, Chair DiTullio. I do have, on the upcoming dates, I wanted to let you know, I think I've gotten one or two of you asking about the appointment of the planning commissioner, and that will happen on, sorry, get the mic closer to me, January 22nd. So following that, and I don't know more about it than that, but following that, we will have a new commissioner to fill our vacancy. And then we will not, and Tammy, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we will not be having a February 1st Planning Commission meeting, but we will have a meeting on the 15th. So mark your calendars for that. And then just a couple of quick project and development updates. The Tabor Lake Apartments, which was the former Howard Johnson Motel over on 44th, that has received its final CO. And then on the city plan, I wanted to let you know that we opened it up for people to sign up as city plan champions or just opening it up to subscribers. I think it was just last week. And we already have 38 champions interested and 168 subscribers. So that was really good news. And we're planning a kickoff between staff and the consultant CZB on January 31st. I don't know any more about that at this time. I think it's still tentative, but I believe that's the date. And then we're also working through right now getting some steering committee dates and open house dates on the calendars. So a lot of good stuff going on with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner updates, Mr. Kearns?
I don't have anything.
Commissioner Gravy? Sure.
I just wanted to thank City Council and staff for how they went about both meeting the state law, but also being forward-thinking about expanding it to the extent that would help the city function in an efficient manner in the future. And then I would also, just kind of on the record, express appreciation for some of the public comment that were provided on these agenda items because they were thoughtful and detailed. And, just a couple of thoughts I think are important to consider, when you follow with regard to the EV issue, the adoption of new EVs, on the road have grown remarkably relative to, the rates in the past. And I think most folks are aware that concerns about charging, range issues, or range anxiety, they call it, and these kind of things are a primary reason that they might not grow even more quickly. And so these types of things are extremely important to advance that. And I think that that's also related to some of the comments that were expressed about cost of EVs, because there's already been an appetite shown for manufacturers, and as the demand from the consumer side increases, costs will decrease, and of course, demand's going to increase when the infrastructure is built out. So I think it's important to make these types of changes on the local level. So I appreciate this work.
Thank you. Commissioner Quinn?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Once again, thanks for all the reports. You did a great job, as usual. Another shameless plug for the city project map. That's really fun to watch and look at. That's wonderful. And as my esteemed colleague had said, I really appreciate the public's interest in taking the time to make the comments. So it's really nice to see that that's happening.
Mr. Shelkey?
Maybe just a comment about the cost of EVs. EVs are very expensive right now, but if you look what's going on in China, EVs are very cheap. And if those EVs at some point in time will be imported here, it's going to drive the prices down of EVs. So this whole concept, when we talked about the affordable housing and can't afford an EV, well, they can't afford an EV today, but I think in the future that may not be the case. That may be the cheapest transportation for people.
Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion to adjourn, seconded by Mr. Gravy. Commissioner Gravy, please poll the commission.
Motion approved, 5-0.